The bass from the ballroom vibrated through the reinforced glass of the terrace doors, a dull, rhythmic thud that felt entirely disconnected from the freezing Chicago air out here. I leaned against the stone balustrade, my dark suit absorbing the chill of the November night. Inside, 300 industry executives were busy pretending they didn't want to slaughter each other for market share. Out here, it was just the wind, the distant sirens, and the sudden, sharp sound of a sliding glass door clicking shut. I didn't turn around immediately. I prefer to observe the reflection in the glass first. The silhouette was unmistakable. Silver hair catching the ambient light of the city skyline, framing a posture so rigid it looked like it might snap under the weight of the evening. Madeline Gardner. 40 years old, CEO of Gardner Logistics and currently the target of a quiet, methodical corporate assassination. I watched her reflection. Something was wrong. Her hands, usually so precise, were trembling as she reached behind her back. She turned, her back to the sprawling cityscape, and looked over her shoulder at me. The champagne-colored fabric of her evening gown caught the low terrace lighting. It was an elegant dress, armor for the gala, but the hidden zipper down the spine had caught halfway up. She didn't offer a preamble. She didn't apologize for interrupting my solitude. Her eyes, shadowed by exhaustion that makeup couldn't completely hide, met mine. "Sit me up." The words were in order, but the slight waver in her voice betrayed a fracture. I pushed off the balustrade, keeping my movements deliberate and slow. "Turn around," I said, my voice lower than the wind. I didn't step into her space aggressively. I closed the distance and stopped exactly 1 arm's length away. The cold air hung between us. I reached out, my knuckles brushing the silk-lined edge of the fabric, strictly avoiding the warmth of her skin. The zipper was jammed on a loose thread. I stabilized the base of the track with my left hand, a purely mechanical action, and worked the metal slider free with my right. A sharp upward pull, and the teeth locked into place. The sudden silence that fell over me wasn't from the soundproofing of the doors. It was the quiet room of my own mind finally stilling just from being near her. I stepped back immediately, plunging my hands deep into my trouser pockets before they could decide to linger. "Thread caught," I reported, keeping my tone clipped and professional. "It's secure." Madeline exhaled, a shaky breath that plumed in the freezing air. "Thank you, Jackson." She turned to face me fully, her silver hair shifting around her shoulders. She didn't look like a CEO right now. She looked like someone standing on the edge of a very steep drop. "I didn't come out here just for wardrobe malfunctions." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a volume that forced me to lean in slightly to hear her over the muffled bass. "Marcus Vance filed a formal complaint of fiduciary negligence against me with the board this afternoon. He's claiming $50 million is unaccounted for in the Q3 European expansion ledgers." I felt the familiar, cold calculus of my profession engage. "Is it?" I asked, my voice devoid of judgment. "No." Her jaw tightened. "But the internal audit team is loyal to him. If I don't prove the funds were properly allocated by the emergency board meeting on Friday, they'll force a vote of no confidence. I need you, Jackson. Not as my firm's standard consultant. I need you off the books. I need you to rip those ledgers apart and find the fabricated discrepancies before Friday." I watched her twist the heavy silver ring on her right index finger, a nervous tell she never displayed in the boardroom. The stakes were absolute. If she went down, Vance would gut the company and sell the parts. My firm would lose our largest contract, but more than that, the injustice of it grated against the very core of my being. I pulled my right hand from my pocket, retrieved my phone, and checked the time. 72 hours, I stated, doing the math. I'll need raw, unfiltered access to the mainframe. No internal IT gatekeepers. I want the metadata logs, the timestamp reconciliation reports, and the shadow server backups from the Frankfurt office. Madeline's posture relaxed, just a fraction of an inch, as the burden transferred. "You'll have it by midnight." "I'll start tonight," I told her, my voice steady, an anchor in the storm she was navigating. "Go back inside, Madeline. Smile at the investors. Let me handle the dirt." By 2 a.m., the Gardner Logistics headquarters was a tomb of glass and steel. I sat in the sub-basement server room, the ambient hum of the cooling racks the only sound. The monitors cast a harsh blue glare across the temporary desk I'd set up. Madeline had delivered on her promise. I was buried deep in the Frankfurt ledgers, running a custom cross-referencing script I'd built specifically for tracing layered shell company distributions. The data was a mess, deliberately obfuscated. Vance hadn't just moved money, he had buried the movement under layers of legitimate-looking operational expenses. The security door hissed open behind me. I didn't jump. I recognized the rhythmic, sharp click of Madeline's heels on the linoleum. She walked in carrying 2 steaming paper cups. She had swapped the gala gown for a pair of dark slacks and a cashmere sweater, but the exhaustion around her eyes had deepened. "You shouldn't be down here," I said, my eyes not leaving the scrolling lines of code on my left monitor. "If Vance's people check the access logs, your badge swipe links you to this terminal." "I used Sarah's badge," Madeline replied softly, setting one of the cups near my elbow. General Counsel Sarah was the only other person in the building who knew I was here. Madeline pulled up a metal folding chair and sat beside me. "Black coffee, no sugar, just the way you endure it." I paused my script and finally looked at her. Her hands were wrapped tightly around her own cup, the paper trembling slightly. It wasn't the cold this time. It was the adrenaline crash. I felt a sudden, sharp instinct to cover her hands with mine, to stop the tremor by sheer force of will. Instead, I reached over, adjusted the small space heater I'd commandeered under the desk, and angled it directly toward her feet. "Drink," I instructed, keeping my tone flat to mask the spike in my pulse. "You haven't slept since Tuesday." She managed a weak smile, lifting the cup. "Neither have you, Jackson. Have you found anything?" "Vance is sloppy," I stated, turning back to the screens. I tapped a specific line of hex code highlighted in yellow. He used a recursive transfer protocol to route the expansion funds through a third-party vendor in Zurich. On paper, it looks like a legitimate supply chain payout, but if you isolate the timestamp metadata, I executed a command and a new window snapped open. The vendor didn't exist until 3 days after the funds were supposedly cleared. It's a ghost entity. Madeline exhaled, the sound loud in the quiet room. It wasn't a gasp. It was the heavy sigh of someone who had just realized the knife in their back was exactly where they suspected it was. "Can we prove he authorized it?" "Working on it," I said. "The digital signature is masked. I need to trace the IP address of the originating terminal. It will take time." "Time is the one currency we don't have," she whispered. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her face buried in her hands. The sheer weight of the company was crushing her, and I hated the men who had put it there. "Madeline." I waited until she lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine. I didn't offer empty reassurances. I didn't tell her it would be okay. I gave her the only thing that mattered in this room: absolute certainty. I will find the origin point. You focus on securing the loyal board members. Do not let Vance see you sweat. The next 2 days blurred into a single continuous loop of caffeine, glowing screens, and the meticulous unraveling of corporate sabotage. We fell into a silent routine. I worked the data, she managed the optics upstairs. Twice a day she would come down to the sub-basement, bringing food I wouldn't have remembered to eat, and we would sit in the humming quiet. We didn't talk about the impending disaster. We talked about the logistics. It was a domesticity forged in the fires of an audit, our interactions stripped of corporate pretense. On Thursday afternoon, exactly 20 hours before the board meeting, the monitors went black. I hit the manual override switch on my keyboard. Nothing. The server fans spun down into a terrifying silence. The primary network connection had been severed at the physical switch level. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Madeline.
Jackson.
Her voice was tight, strained to the breaking point.
Vance just called an emergency executive session. He's locked me out of the primary accounts. He cited critical security irregularities and had IT revoke my administrative privileges pending the board review.
A financial freeze. He was accelerating the timeline to prevent me from finishing the trace. "Where are you?" I demanded, grabbing my suit jacket from the back of the chair.
My office. They're coming to confiscate my hard drives.
"Do not let them in," I ordered, already moving toward the stairwell. I didn't wait for the elevator. I took the fire stairs 2 at a time, calculating the variables. Without her admin privileges, my backdoor access to the Frankfurt logs was dead. But I already had the ghost entity's routing numbers saved locally. I just needed the final authorization signature. I burst through the fire doors onto the executive floor. 2 men in cheap suits from the internal audit department were standing outside Madeline's locked glass door, looking uncomfortable. I didn't break stride. I walked directly past them, swiped my master access card, a perk of being the external fixer they hadn't thought to revoke yet, and stepped into her office, locking the door behind me. Madeline was standing behind her heavy oak desk, her posture rigid, her hands gripping the edge of the wood so tightly her knuckles were white. The silence in her office wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I crossed the room, stepping into her space, blocking her view of the men outside the glass.
They're early, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's over, Jackson. If they take the drives, Vance controls the narrative.
They aren't taking anything, I said, my voice low and completely steady. I reached out and gently gripped her wrist, my thumb resting over her racing pulse. It wasn't a romantic touch. It was a grounding wire, a physical transfer of stability from my calm to her panic. Breathe, Madeline. The drives are encrypted. Even if they take them, they can't read them for days. We have what we need. She looked up at me, the armor finally cracking.
I built this company, Jackson. I gave up everything for it. And he's going to steal it with a fabricated spreadsheet.
No, I said firmly, releasing her wrist and stepping back to maintain the boundary. He isn't. I pulled a thick manila folder from inside my jacket. I finished the trace 10 minutes before the servers died. The IP address that authorized the ghost entity transfer wasn't from the Frankfurt office. It was from a secure VPN routed through a private server in the Cayman Islands. I opened the folder, revealing a stack of heavily redacted documents. A server registered to an LLC owned by Marcus Vance's brother-in-law. Madeline stared at the paper, the reality of the proof slowly replacing the fear in her eyes. The power shifted in the room, a palpable transfer of leverage.
You documented the chain of custody, she asked, the CEO returning to her voice.
Timestamps, hash values, and certified ISP logs, I confirmed, tapping the page. It is legally admissible and entirely undeniable. A sharp knock rapped against the glass door. Vance stood there, a smug smile playing on his lips, holding a legal document. I didn't look at him. I kept my focus entirely on Madeline. He's going to offer you a deal, I warned her quietly. He'll offer a quiet resignation in exchange for dropping the negligence charges. Do not sign it. Madeline straightened her shoulders. The tremor in her hands was gone.
Open the door, Jackson.
I unlocked the door and stepped back, allowing Vance and his 2 auditors to enter. Vance looked at me, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Mr. Hart, this is an internal matter. Your consulting services are no longer required. I serve at the pleasure of the CEO, Marcus, I replied dryly, not moving an inch from my position beside Madeline's desk. And she hasn't dismissed me. Vance sneered, turning his attention to Madeline. He tossed a heavy, staple-bound contract onto her desk. "We can do this the hard way tomorrow, Madeline. Or we can do it the clean way today. Sign the separation agreement. You walk away with your equity intact, and the board doesn't see the Q3 disaster." Madeline didn't look at the document. She looked at Vance. "You mean the disaster you fabricated using a recursive transfer protocol through a Zurich ghost entity?" Vance's smug smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid stillness. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "The ledgers show..." Before he could finish the lie, I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I picked up the contract he had thrown on the desk. I flipped to the final page, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon rapidly. "Clause 4B, I read aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet office. "The outgoing CEO waives all rights to independent external audit regarding the Q3 European expansion." It's a trap, Madeline. If you sign this, you legally validate his fabricated numbers and indemnify him from prosecution. I dropped the contract back onto the desk, pushing it toward Vance. "The contract is garbage, Marcus, just like your VPN routing." I pulled the top sheet from my manila folder and placed it deliberately on top of his separation agreement. "That is the certified ISP log tracing the $50 million directly to an LLC owned by your brother-in-law. I've already forwarded a copy to General Counsel Sarah, and a secondary copy is queued to hit the SEC regulatory portal the moment the board meeting begins tomorrow." The room went entirely silent. The two internal auditors took a synchronized step backward, suddenly desperate to be anywhere else. Vance stared at the paper, his face draining of color. The leverage he had spent months building had just been atomized by a single sheet of paper. This is fabricated," Vance stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the document. "Measurable reality, Marcus," I corrected him softly. "Math doesn't lie. But you do. I suggest you call your lawyer. You're going to need a very good one." I stepped back, allowing Madeline to deliver the final blow. She didn't yell. She didn't gloat. She simply pointed to the door. "Get out of my office, Marcus, and clear out your desk. You're fired." Vance opened his mouth to argue, saw the absolute finality in her eyes, and then looked at the undeniable proof on the desk. He turned and walked out, the two auditors scurrying behind him. The door clicked shut. The silence returned, but it was different now. The suffocating pressure was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp air of victory. Madeline sank into her desk chair, her hands covering her face. I didn't speak. I stood by the window, giving her the space to process the massive adrenaline drop. After a long minute, she lowered her hands. "You did it," she whispered, looking at the manila folder. "You saved the company." "You saved the company, Madeline," I corrected her quietly, remaining by the window. "I just provided the tools. You stood your ground." She shook her head, a soft, weary smile touching her lips. "Why, Jackson? Why risk your firm's reputation, your license, for this, for me?" I looked at her. Really looked at her. At the silver hair, the lines of exhausted competence around her eyes, the sheer, unrelenting grit that defined her character. I felt the familiar urge to build a wall, to compartmentalize the emotion and retreat back into the safety of numbers. But the numbers didn't matter anymore. "Because I couldn't let him take it from you," I said, choosing the hardest, honest answer. I kept my hands in my pockets, refusing to close the distance. Because watching you fight this alone was unacceptable. Madeline stood up. She didn't walk around the desk immediately. She simply looked at me, seeing past the sharp suits and the detached professionalism.
You're always fixing things, Jackson. Always building the shelter. But who builds the shelter for you?
I don't need one, I lied smoothly.
Yes, you do.
She walked around the desk, crossing the room until she stood directly in front of me. She didn't touch me. She just stood there, offering a quiet, absolute presence. You've spent your whole life reading the fine print, looking for the trap. There is no trap here, Jackson. I swallowed hard, the tight control I maintained slipping just a fraction. I pulled my hands from my pockets. I didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. I reached out and gently took her right hand, the one that had been twisting the silver ring all week. I laced my fingers through hers. The sudden stillness hit me again, heavier this time. It felt like dropping an anchor in a raging sea. The endless, exhausting calculation in my mind finally stopped. I know, I said quietly, my voice barely audible in the empty office. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. The board meeting the next morning was a formality. Madeline and I walked into the glass-walled conference room together, a united front. She stood at the head of the table, composed and absolute. Vance wasn't there. General Counsel Sarah distributed the audit packets I had prepared. I sat 2 seats down from Madeline, perfectly silent, while she dismantled Vance's legacy with calm, undeniable facts. She didn't need me to speak for her. She owned the room. I simply watched her, admiring the precision of her delivery, the absolute command she wielded. When the unanimous vote of confidence was recorded, the room erupted into quiet murmurs of relief. Madeline dismissed the board. As the executives filed out, she remained at the head of the table, stacking her papers. I stayed in my seat, waiting until the room was empty. She picked up her leather portfolio and walked over to me. She didn't offer a grand speech. She reached into her pocket and placed a small, heavy object on the glass table in front of me. It was a spare key card to the executive elevator. A practical symbol. A permanent access pass. The Frankfurt office needs a full structural overhaul, she said, her tone professional, but her eyes holding a warmth that hadn't been there a week ago. I need an external consultant, permanently. I picked up the key card. It felt heavy in my palm. The weight of a future that didn't involve hiding in the sub-basement. I looked up at her, slipping the card into my breast pocket. I'll draft the terms, I replied, my voice steady, sealing the promise. Closing thoughts. I learned that true safety isn't found in isolation or perfect data. It's found when you finally trust someone enough to let them see the variables you can't control. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.